Hello guys, welcome back to another video. It has been quite some time. I've been very busy with school, but I'm here today to start going over some of the revealed cards for the newest Cards expansion. If you haven't heard of it already, it is called Winter War. It is coming out November 29th, and yeah, you can pre-order now in the shop, but we're going to jump straight into it because we're going to be looking at all of the new cards. So I did this series before with the Brothers in Arms expansion, and essentially the idea is I'm going to go over all of the cards, around 20 or so at a time, that have been announced as they are announced, and give my initial thoughts on the card, how I think they're going to be run, how useful they are. But to be very clear, if you're watching this in the future, this is not a crafting guide because we've not played with the cards yet. They are not out. We don't know what the meta is going to look like. We don't know if these things are going to be changed before they're released, if things are going to be nerfed within a couple of weeks. Who knows? But let's jump into
What a
it.
performance there by J King.
J King, full plot armor.
J King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J King is our world champion. J King 7. What? The back-to-back Cards world champion.
So the first card that we're going to be looking at here is the first Stridsgruppen. Apologies in advance. These pronunciations are going to be awful. And if you're looking at this and you immediately think, wait, what nation is this? This looks white. This is because this card is for Finland. Because Finland is going to be the next ally nation being introduced to cards. So this is going to be the 9th nation in the game, the 4th minor nation, alongside Italy, France, and Poland, where you can only play it as a minor. However, this is going to be very exciting. Because we've seen when these allied nations usually have much stronger identities. So with France, you have these mobilized, you have the resistance. With Italy, you have the Alpine, you have like these very fast aggro cards, as well as these control, these healing cards, Mare Nostrum, 7th Alpini. Poland, you have legions, you have exile, intel. So we're going to get to see what Finland's theme is. This is their very first card. It is a 2-cost, 1/4 infantry, 1 operation cost, has +2 attack against units with higher attack, which is going to be almost anything. So this is functionally a 2-cost 3/4. However, it doesn't hit face for 3. So this is already pretty good stats, and it has the keyword salvage, which is one of the new keywords being introduced with the Winter War expansion. And the salvage keyword, as has been revealed now, is when it destroys a unit, add that unit to your hand with its stats set to 1/1, and its cost being the original cost to a max of 3. So if it costs less than 3, it has the original cost. If it costs 3 or more, it will always cost 3, with the stats 1/1, but with the effect the same. So if you can salvage something with any keyword, any deployment effect, destruction effect, anything, the text will stay the same, the stats will be a 1/1, and the cost will be capped at 3 credits. So how good is salvage? Salvage is pretty good. It's really going to depend on the meta, because it's going to depend on the quality of units you can salvage. And it might encourage people to start running more removal, since salvage really does punish people for essentially relying on trading, relying on your opponent to trade, relying on just unit-to-unit combat. You're going to be wanting to run removal to remove these salvage units, so you're not just giving your opponent value. On the other hand, if your units are largely terrible, like if you're running, not terrible as in like actively bad, but bad in a salvaged form, where you're just running a lot of vanilla units, maybe you want to be giving your opponent these, because they do go to your hand, and you have a fairly limited hand space, and you're probably going to be running salvage primarily in control. So if you can clog up their hand with salvage, that prevents them from drawing other things. So salvage is a very interesting mechanic that's going to have a lot of interplay for both opponents. So how good is this card? I mean, I think if you're playing a salvage deck, if you're playing an entire deck themed around salvage, this seems like a pretty good card to throw into that. However, I don't think this is going to be the card that's making the deck. You're not going to be picking Finland as an ally to run this card. It's not that good. But, it's not terrible, and we're really going to have to see what the meta's looking like to understand how good salvage is in practice. So moving on to the second card, it is the Infantry Regiment 13. It is a 5-cost 2/4 guard for Finland. 5-cost 2/4 guard sounds really bad, but the deployment is get +1/+1 for each enemy unit anywhere on the board. So this can get up to +9/+9, which would make this an 11/13 guard, which, is very, very good. In reality, how good is this? Because for a 5-cost guard, you're probably looking for, the best comparison would be Osaka Regiment, which is a 4/7 guard for 5. So for this, if your opponent has 2 units on the board, it's a 4/6, not great. If they have 3 units on the board, it's a 5/7, better than Osaka. However, Osaka's never seen play. That's largely because it's Japanese. But you really want your opponent to have at least 3 units on the board before you start getting a ton of value out of this. However, the fact that it just continues to rise the more units that they have on the board is pretty good. However, if they're having a lot of units on the board, it's probably because they're aggro, and if they're aggro, you kind of get diminishing returns on stats on guards. Because if they have removal for it, they're just going to remove it regardless of how big it is, like with something like Sendai's, surprise attacks, whatever it may be, half track to return it to hand. That doesn't really care about how much stats it has. So you're kind of getting diminishing returns, but again, I don't think this card is terrible. It's probably going to be really good in draft. I don't think it's going to be breaking anything. In constructed, I really doubt it's going to be breaking into constructed. Maybe it's like a 1 or 2 of, if Finland control sees play. But again, these are cards that are not going to be. They're good cards you could add to a Finnish control deck. They're not cards that are going to be making Finnish control, because if you're putting this in your deck, it means you are not running any other ally nation. And other allies have guards, and maybe those guards are weaker than this, but they're going to have other things. So we need to see other things for Finland, for this to be particularly relevant. Speaking about other things for Finland, we have Sisu, which is a 3-cost Finnish order, limited. When your HQ, it's a countermeasure, not an order. When your HQ is to take damage, the enemy HQ takes the damage instead. So this is a bit of an odd way of wording this, I suppose. But think of this as retaliation, which is the German countermeasure. When your HQ takes damage, deal the same amount of damage to the enemy. This is, you are dealing that damage to the enemy instead. So you are not taking damage. It's basically like retaliation, but it also stops the damage. For 3 credits, this seems really... It doesn't seem good. I'm going to be honest. I think this card is just complete trash. Because the cost on countermeasures increases how good the card needs to be substantially more than any other type of card, because countermeasures, you are paying the cost potentially multiple times. So if the card costs 2 versus 3, it's not just simply a 1 credit difference. You might have to hold it up 2 or 3 turns in a row, in which case it's a 3 credit difference. Also, the more expensive it is, the more obvious you are holding it up, because it's very easy to end a turn with floating 1 credit. It's much harder to end a turn floating 3 credits, and if you're playing Finland, Finland does not have it's a new nation. Presumably it's not going to have like a dozen different countermeasures to play around. So if you float 3 credits with Finland ally, they're probably going to figure it's Sisu attack with the lowest attack thing, the same as playing around any other countermeasure, and because countermeasures can only trigger on the opponent's turn, there's no weird combo you can set up with this. I think it's just kind of a bad card. So let's not spend too much time on that, and instead get to a good card, Lotus Svard. Again, apologies to anybody who speaks Finnish. This is a 2-cost Finnish order. Your units get +1 defense and -1 operation cost, and this is permanent. So we've seen a lot of other operation cost reduction cards that are temporary, such as Pursuit, Blitzkrieg. This is a permanent operation cost reduction on all of your units, which is a very, very, very powerful effect. And on top of that, you also get +1 defense on all of your units, which is not bad by any means. So this is a very, very powerful card. The problem I see with this is this is probably a card you want to run in a deck like US Midrange, a deck like Heinz, where it's a fast-paced, aggressive-oriented deck that is not running 0 operation cost units. So you're not really going to want to run this in Jaguar because they already largely have 0 operation cost units, so you're not actually getting the value out of this. And you're probably not going to want to run this in Control because you usually don't have a lot of units on the board, and if you do, you usually have the credits to operate with them, or you don't want to operate with them because they're guards and you're just going to be playing orders while the guards offer you protection. So it's odd with that in mind because the +1 defense definitely seems like a more control-oriented card. However, the -1 operation seems like a more aggressive-oriented card. Although +1 defense in aggressive decks is not anything to scoff at. Aggressive decks actually do enjoy additional defense because it keeps their units outside of AoE range, as well as just like if getting the difference between 1 and 2 health is a big deal in a lot of matchups, just for things like Bloody Sickle where it's just going to ping it off. So the card itself would be good in a deck like Fast Times. However, again, it's the issue with this card being Finnish. Is there going to be enough other Finnish cards that you want to run in a deck like Fast Times to justify you running this over top of US, where you're going to have things like We Can Do It, you're going to have things like Greyhound, Hellcat, etc. Is this worth running over top of that on its own? I really, really doubt it. However, depending on what other Finnish cards are revealed, this could see play, and this is going to be a card that I think is going to be very, very relevant in the future as Finland gets more and more cards in each successive expansion. I think this is going to be one of those Finnish cards to keep an eye on each time they reveal new Finnish cards, because I think this card has a lot of potential. So now we are done with the first wave of Finnish cards. I'm showing you these cards and giving my thoughts on them in the order that they are revealed. I'm not going to do all of the ones that I revealed up until this point because I'm a bit behind the ball. There's about like 35 or so that have been revealed. I'm only going to be doing the first 22 in this video. But those were the first like 4 Finnish. Day 1, they announced the expansion. Those are the first Finnish cards to give us a taste of what Finland is going to be looking like. Then we get on to German, where Germany is getting a veteran card. This is the first veteran card that they've announced so far. So the original starting stats of this is a 2-cost, 2/3 infantry, 1 operation cost, and blitz, which, you know, on its own, it's not great, but it's not terrible. And its veteran effect is becomes veteran if it starts your turn in the front line. Which, you know, you can get it to the front line on turn 3, and then your opponent has an opportunity to kill it, and if they can't, then it becomes veteran. The veteran's going to need to be pretty good for this to see any amount of play. And the veteran effect is when this becomes veteran, gain 3 additional credits. So the veteran effect is very, 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 very good. Now the question is, how effectively can decks harness this? Because the triggering condition is somewhat difficult to achieve. Keeping a 2/3 infantry alive in the front line for a turn is not an easy feat, and you're going to get the most value out of the 3 additional credits earlier in the game. And earlier in the game, you're going to have less options to set up to keep this guy alive. So I don't think you're going to be really running this with any, like, big brain combos to try to, like, keep this alive in the front line. I think if you play this, you just play it with the knowledge that, yeah, maybe my opponent removes it, but if my opponent removes a 2-cost, 2/3 infantry, maybe I'm just fine with that because it means they're not removing other units I might play. Also importantly here is it goes up to 3 attacks, so it gains an attack point when it becomes veteran, which is not a big deal. But importantly, it loses blitz. The veteran version does not have blitz, which means if you're trying to play this and trigger its veteran effect, so as to play this and gain the 3 credits immediately, it's not going to be able to blitz. So if you have the Soviet card that triggers veteran effects as they come onto the board, it will pay for itself and then some. You will play this and then gain an additional credit. However, it will not gain blitz. So you can't push this to the front line after that. So, you know, the people there still dreaming of the Soviet-German veteran deck. Unfortunately, this is not going to be the nutty card you might hope it to be because the veteran does not have blitz. However, if you push this to the front line on turn 3, it can attack on turn 4, since it's still considered the same unit. I think this has potential to see play in Frontline. Frontline is losing Whirlwind. I'll do a video talking about the rotation later. So Frontline is losing Whirlwind. It's losing a couple other things. And with Jagro being very, very heavily affected, Frontline is suddenly being positioned as the #1 deck that is competing for the Frontline early in the game. And this might just be good enough to run in that, because, like, you know, if you get like a Red Devils to the front line on turn 2, and then you push this guy up on turn 3, your opponent's going to be killing this, which both means that they are not developing more units to contest your front line, but rather they are trading out this unit, and it will also mean that your turn 4 is now open to play Sherman, and if they can't kill this on turn 3, or they favor killing the Red Devils instead of this to stop the Sherman, then on turn 4, you're going to have 7 credits. And 7 credits is a lot very early in the game for Frontline, because Frontline is a deck that struggles for credits. You're really trying to, like, operate your units as well as get units onto the board, and it could let you get things out early, like a We Can Do It. Like, if you play turn 1, 164th, turn 2, Red Devils, turn 3, Panzer Grenadier, turn 4, 35T, We Can Do It, that is a very, very strong board. That is a terrifying board. So it could see play in Frontline. There's also, you could run this gimmicky with War Production. If you play War Production, you can get this guy to the front line on turn 1. Now, obviously, that requires playing Germany's and Soviet and running War Productions, which means you probably don't want to be running a lot of other orders. So what you can do with that, I'm not sure. But you guys can get this guy to the front line on turn 1 with War Production for just, like, trying to maximize your credit cheat potential. But I think that's probably going to be a bit more of a gimmicky deck. But all around, very interesting card that I think has potential, and I think people are going to test around with it. Then we have the 139 Gebirgsjäger, which is a 4-cost 3/4 infantry for Germany. It's a special. And this is Alpine. So it's Alpine is a very powerful effect, and it's a very powerful effect specifically related to the number of Alpine units you can fit into your deck, the number of Alpine units you can get onto the board at once. And Alpine traditionally is a bit more of a mid-range style deck, where you're really just trying to put an overwhelming number of stats onto the board until your opponent can't deal with it, and then you just win by hitting them in the face for 9 a couple times. So a 4-cost Alpine is kind of getting onto the high end of the cost of Alpine units you want to run in the deck, because you do want to be able to get them out of your hand quickly. However, this is German, which means you can run this without costing any other Alpine slots, unlike any Italian Alpine cards. And the effect on this card is deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ when you add or deploy an Alpine unit. So this is not going to be the guy who you're going to be playing and then pushing to the front line immediately as just a large statted unit. Rather, this is going to be the guy you keep in the front line, and you're just going to be dealing 2 damage to your opponent every single turn as you play other Alpines that are going to be contesting for the front line, maybe getting into the front line, and those other Alpine units are hopefully going to be the ones eating removal, since you push them into the front line and keep this guy back. So, all around, I think this is a very powerful card. I think you're going to run this in Alpine as a 2 of. I think if it was a standard, for example, you might not run 4 of them. So I think special rarity doesn't matter too much, because I think 2 is probably the sweet spot for a card like this. Because on its own, it does not do a lot. Like, if you're playing this on turn 4 with no other Alpine units, this card sucks. However, if you're playing this on turn 4 as like a 5/6, and then it proceeds to deal 6 damage to the opponent on the following turn, that's a very, very, very good card. So the strength of this card is just going to rely entirely on the strength of Alpine, which Alpine is looking pretty, pretty good. I think that's safe to say. I don't think it's going to be the #1 deck, although I could be wrong about that. But I think Alpine is going to be... It's safe to say that Alpine is back, and this guy is going to be a card you see a lot of when the expansion drops. So then let's look at a different German card, going in a very different direction. It is Focused Attack, a 6-cost German order. Your infantry and tanks get +1/+1 for each unit type you control. So immediately looking at this, you might think of Combined Arms as a 1-cost, give a tank +1/+1 for each unit type you control. and think, why would I want to spend 5 additional credits for that effect? However, this is your infantries and tanks get +1/+1 for each unit type you control, and it's all of them at once. So I think it's better to think of this card as more of a card like We Can Do It, or a card like Alliance, where it's sort of just like this high-end buff everything. So for example, if you have, say, 2 tanks on the board, an infantry, and like an artillery, this is 6 cost, give 3 of your units +3/+3, which is not great. But again, it's a standard card. If you compare it, Cards traditionally has very, very weak AoE buffs, and it's probably for a very, very good reason, because if you look at the handful of good AoE buffs, they see a lot of play, like Close Air Support, Naval Supply Run, Calm Before the Storm before it was nerfed, Alliance before it was nerfed, We Can Do It still. AoE buffs are very, very powerful. This card is not very powerful. However, I think its intention is not to be powerful. I think its intention is more of, this is just a very fun card to build your deck around, because there's a lot of people who play cards not to be competitive, but rather play cards to be thematic, like, build specific decks around plain, like, fun cards that are, like, units that historically went together on, like, a specific front. And this is going to be a card for those people where they like to have a balance of all of the different unit types in the game, and Focused Attack is going to be a good, cheap finisher for them. It's not a competitive card. So then let's get on to the British cards. We have Halifax B Mark I. It is an 8 cost 5/4 bomber with 3 operation cost. With its deployment, with its card effect, bombers you deploy, including this, deal their attack and damage to a random enemy. So I think the immediate comparisons to this would be B-17, which is a 9 cost 5/5 bomber, deployment destroy a unit. This is an 8 cost 5/4 bomber without the heavy armor, where it functionally has a deployment effect, because when you play it, it deals 5 damage to a random enemy. Now, the very, very big difference between this and something like B-17 is this can go face. This can hit the enemy HQ. This just says enemy, not enemy unit, which at times might be very, very good, because, your opponent has an empty board, and you just slam Halifax, deal 5 to the HQ, and then you slam a second Halifax, and you deal 10 to the HQ and attack phase with the other Halifax, and you won the game. However, that is not the situation that you're going to be playing this card in most of the time. Most of the time, you're going to be playing this card against units on board. You're going to be wanting to use this to deal a lot of damage to units on board, take out some big targets to make sure that they are destroyed. And most of the time, when this hits HQ, you're going to be very, very mad. Because you're not playing this to deal HQ damage. You're not playing an 8 cost bomber to rush your opponent down. If you were trying to do that, you would run Lancaster. You're rather playing this as a control card themed around having big bombers. So, with that being said, how good is this? I think it's worse than B-17, unless you have a lot of support for it. I mean, if you play this with Wellington, you get Wellington down to 0 cost. You can play this, deal 5 damage to a random enemy, and then Wellington for 0 to deal 4 damage to a random enemy. And then you can attack with Wellington. But again, it's an 8 cost 5/4. Like, once it's on the board, it's very hard to combo this with any other bomber immediately, like outside of Wellington. And I don't think you can just save this in hand for Wellington. So, say you just slam Halifax and deal 5 damage. Your opponent's just going to remove it. Like, if you're thinking of the dream situation where you slam Halifax, you slam a second Halifax, you slam like a B-17, and suddenly you're dealing huge amounts of damage all across the board. If you're able to stick a 5/4 bomber and then play a second 5/4 bomber on the following turn, and you're not dead and your opponent can't remove them, you've won the game no matter what those bombers are doing. So that's just not a realistic situation. Realistically, I think maybe there's a world where you could run this in a Brit ramp deck in a very specific meta where this is purposely trying to be heavy and call out things like Soviet control. I think there's a world where that could see play in that deck. Outside of that, without massive credit cheat, I don't think this card is going to see play. Then we have Bomber Run, a 2-cost British order, which gives us an idea of what theme Britain is getting for this expansion. Bomber Run is deal 2 damage to a target unit, deal 5 damage instead if you control a bomber with 5 or more attack. So, essentially, 2-cost deal 2 damage to a target unit, not good. It's not terrible, like, From the People is 3-cost deal 3 damage to a unit. However, From the People doesn't see play. So, it's kind of the normal cost. However, if you have a bomber with 5 or more attack, this deals 5 damage, 2-cost to deal 5 damage to an enemy of any unit type, is very, very good. However, it means you have a 5-attack bomber on the board, so you're either doing this in combination late in the game, where you're playing like Halifax, you deal 5 damage to a random enemy, and then you play Bomber Run to deal 5 damage after your Halifax misses and goes face. I mean, sure. However, like, at that point in the game, do you really want to run a 2-cost card that you are saving to play in combination? Like, you can play it earlier in the game if you're against aggro, so I guess it has that going for it, where it can be played early against aggro, you can save it against control. However, again, it's supporting a big attack bomber deck, which I just don't think is ever going to be good. And if it is ever good, I'm concerned for the state of the meta. Then we get on to Soviets, who, once again, Soviet theme is overpowered elites, because this is the 1/22nd Korsun. It's a 6-cost, 5/7 guard, 1 operation cost. Costs 1 less to deploy for each of your units. So, is this just going to be a staple in every single Soviet deck ever? I'm not convinced that it's going to be a staple in Soviet control, which is odd because it immediately seems like this is the type of card you would run in Soviet control. And the reason I don't think it's going to be an immediate staple in Soviet control, or at least I'm not sure, is the fact that Soviets has a lot of expensive high health guards, and you don't want too many of those. Like, there is a cap. You're not just going to run 5 or 6 cost guards. So there is an extent to which you're just going to stop running guards. And is this better than Naval Brigade? Absolutely not. Is this better than Armor's Train? Absolutely not. Would you run this on top of Armor's Train and Naval Brigade and 272nd as like your high-end defensive units? Maybe. And that's the reason why I don't think it's going to be a staple in Soviet control, is I think it's going to depend on the meta. I think you are going to sometimes run it. I think you're going to sometimes not run it. But that being said, this is absolutely an insane card. This card is ridiculously powerful. So just how good is this card? So the obvious comparison is Grenadier Guards, which is the exact same cost, and it's a 5/9. So it's just a +2 health for the exact same cost, exact same operation. However, Gren Guards is cost 6. This costs 1 less for each other unit you have on board. So if you're just playing this on an empty board on turn 6, it's just a Gren Guard -2 health. However, if you play this with 1 unit on your board, this is just in a better Osaka Regiment. We talked about this earlier. Osaka Regiment is a 5-cost 4/7 guard. So if you play this with 1 unit, it is an Osaka Regiment with +1 attack. If you play this with 2 units missing on board, this is a Seaforth Highlanders with +1 attack that also doesn't have its attack go down on your turn. And remember, Seaforth Highlanders was a card that was nerfed and then rotated. And was run in like every single British control deck ever. So if you have 2 units on board, this is better. This is substantially better than a card that defined Britain control. And if you play this for 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 cost less, it's just ludicrously insane. You're basically just like cheating out like a free huge guy. And because it's 6 costs and you can play it for less, it combos really, really well with the Soviet destroy and replace with a unit of higher cost or similar cost. Now, obviously, I haven't gone over rotation yet, the video on that soon, but rotation, Red Banner and Ural Factories are both getting rotated, if I remember correctly. However, Stand Together works really, really well with this. You can, turn this into a 6-cost Soviet tank, which, if I recall correctly, there is the 4/6 heavy armor KV and the 3/6 heavy armor KV, both of which are very, very good. And Stand Together, with Red Banner leaving, maybe you want to be running Stand Together for your 272nds. More on that later. So, if you get this guy out very early, you do a trade with something big like a 5th Rangers or a Sherman, and then you turn it into a KV, you're very happy that you're just doing Soviet control things. You are just absolutely annihilating your opponent on value. And Soviets typically struggle on tempo, and this is something that can help them catch up. Now, the reason I was specifically saying I'm not sure it's going to be a staple in Soviet control is I think this is going to be a staple in faster decks, ironically, because it's the faster decks that are going to be getting more units onto the board earlier in the game and more consistently trying to stick large number of units on the board that can take advantage of this Corson. So, for example, in self-damage very often has 3-4 units on the board. Like, you're playing things like Scouting Party, you're playing things like Recon that are very cheap units that are just going to sit on the board. You're trying to get out, like, these SUs, the 456, that you can slam 0-cost 34th Guards. So all of the self-damage is built around high tempo, lots of units. And it's not a deck you necessarily think of having a lot of units. You think of lots of units decks like Frontline and Jaguar, where they're like really pressuring the front line very, very quickly. But self-damage just gets a lot of units onto the board slowly, and at any point, just slamming a Corson for, 2-cost, 3-cost, is very, very good. So I think this card is going to be like a staple in things like self-damage. I mean, self-damage is really Soviet's like only other relevant non-control deck. But I think if other Soviet mid-range, potentially even Soviet aggro could run Corson, just because they're turning it into a KV, very, very high potential in aggro, and also just a 5/7 guard if you can get it out for cheap. It doesn't really matter the fact that it's a guard, it's a defensive unit, because it has guard, it has more health, and it has attack. If you can get a 5/7 out on turn 3, you don't care that it has guard, it's a 5/7 on turn 3, it's very, very, very strong. So, Corson, just absolutely an insane card, and I don't know why this is Soviets themes, and I say this as somebody who really loves playing Soviets. Soviets is probably my favorite nation in the game. I don't know why Soviet elites just are better statted than other cards. But then more on Soviets, we have Push, which is a 3-cost Soviet standard. Your HQ takes 3 damage. Deal damage to target equal to damage to your HQ this turn. So if you think about Red Dawn, it's a 1-cost to deal 3 damage to a unit, deal 3 damage to your HQ, or get from the people, but let's be honest, 99 times out of 100 that you play in Red Dawn, you're taking the 3 damage. So if you're just playing Push on turn 3, it's basically just from the people that deals 3 damage to yourself, which is really, really bad. The key caveat here is this says deal damage to target enemy, not deal target or damage to unit or target enemy unit. Which means this can go to the HQ. Now, how good is, like, Air Blitz, for example, German Order 3-cost, deal 3 damage to the enemy HQ? It's not a good card. Nobody plays that card. Now, if Air Blitz could target units or HQ, I think people would consider running that card. However, there's similar cards in the game that don't see a lot of play. Now, the big thing with Push, though, is, and the reason that they printed this card, I think, is trying to get self-damage to, like, you play this in a self-damage deck where you are comboing it with multiple things. So, for example, if you play Red Dawn on turn 4, if you play Red Dawn to remove a unit, and then you play Push, you're taking 6 damage to your HQ that turn, which means Push is dealing 6 damage rather than 3. And that could be 6 damage to remove a second unit, so if your opponent has, like, a Red Devils and a 5th Rangers, you could do Red Dawn Push, remove both of them. Or you can do Red Dawn and then Push to the HQ for 6. Now, how good is burst damage in self-damage? I think very, very bad. I don't think you actually want to run Push in self-damage, which is funny because that seems to be like the main deck that this card is being pushed for. Pun intended. Because self-damage, you're not saving your self-damage cards in hand. You typically want to get them out as quickly as possible or play them on specific turns like Winter Warfare when you have recons on the board. And you typically don't care about burst damage because you win by having overwhelming stats. You're trying to cheat out as many stats as possible, as quickly as possible, and overwhelm your opponent before they can either kill you or get enough removal or threats in their hand that they can respond to your threats. So just burst damage doesn't factor into the game plan at all. And I don't think, like, even if it could, it seems difficult. Now, where I think Push is going to see play is the fact that this combo is so easy. It is so easy to deal 20 damage in one turn. So, for example, you can do Red Dawn, Push, and that is 21 damage to the HQ, to the enemy HQ. because you were taking 6 damage to yourself through the two red dons, and then you were dealing 9 damage to the opponent with the first push, and then the second push, since it stacks on all of the previous other things, it's not deal 3 damage or deal damage equal to the amount of damage you have taken since your last push or something like that. There's no caveat that says that the pushes can't stack, which means that your second push after first push double red dawn is going to be dealing 12 damage. So you're now dealing 9 plus 12 to the HQ. So that's, with 2 copies of 2 standards, you can deal 21 damage for 8 credits. Now, obviously, you need to have 12 or more health for that to work, or else you are killing yourself. You are taking 12 damage in the process of this combo. So it is interesting. You can't easily combine it with Great Patriotic War. Just because, you set yourself to 12, you set your opponent to 12. However, you take 12 damage to deal 12 damage with push. You could do something like set your opponent to 12 with Great Patriotic War, and then you do single red dawn, and then you do push for 6 damage, and then second push for 9 damage. So you only take 9 damage. Your opponent, however, is taking 15 damage. But, that's a several turn setup because that costs 13 to do. And so unless you have ramp or credit sheet. But yeah, I think push is going to be a combo card. And I kind of hope that they change this because at standard, that seems a bit too easy to combo with. I do not want to play in a meta of just Soviet Britain, Soviet, stall out the opponent, heal a bunch, and then as soon as you draw all of your standard combo pieces, just go ham. So yeah, I think if any card was going to be changed between now and the expansion, my money would be on push because oh my goodness. Then let's get to Japan, which is arguably getting hit the hardest by rotation. So Japan is really going to need some new powerful cards to pick up the slack. And Winter Regiment is exactly that. It is a 4-cost 4/4 infantry with blitz and salvage, with the text fully repair this unit when it salvages a unit. So I think the most immediate comparison that this has is Schützen, which is the 4-cost 4/5 blitz infantry. Becomes veteran when it destroys something, and the veteran is a 5/5. And because of the way veteran works, it fully heals the unit in the process. So if this comes out and it hits something and it destroys it, it fully repairs when it salvages a unit. So when this comes out and it hits something, it destroys it, and because it destroys it, it salvages it, and because it salvages it, it heals. So this is a very, very strong mid-range card where it's going to be able to compete with things like Frontline. And even if you're not getting this, to heal, like if you're trading this with a 5th Rangers, for example, you're still salvaging a 5th Rangers, which means, you can play that as like a 3-cost 5/5, because you pick the +4/+4 on the salvaged version. So it's just generating value in a way that Japan mid-range typically is not able to do. As well as can just be a very high tempo card, because if your opponent has, say, a 3/4 in the front line or a 3/3, you just play this out, you trade with it, you heal, so you're already netting a whole lot of stats in a big tempo play, as well as you gain a card in your hand. Now, how good is that card? Probably not that good on average, but, it's not nothing. And it's able to continue to heal, since this is not a one-time effect like the Schützen veteran. If the opponent continues to have units that have less than 4 attack in the front line, or if you get this to the front line and they continue to have units less than 4 attack in the support line, you can continue to just farm units off of this. This could potentially salvage an entire hand worth of things to play. You could be empty-handed, but if your opponent doesn't have a response to Winter Regiment, you can just keep slamming down salvage units, because the Winter Regiment will just keep healing. And that is an interesting possibility. Maybe Japan is going to move in the direction of a salvage-oriented Japan mid-range deck. Then we have a different Japan card in a very different direction. We have Forced Surrender, which is a 1-cost Japanese order. Pin a target unit. Enemy units currently pinned are pinned for an extra turn. Which means that if all of the opponent's units are pinned, so say the opponent has 4 units. Say they have 4 units in their support line. And then say you play Under Fire or Suisse to pin 3 of those 4 units. And then you play Forced Surrender to pin the 4th unit. This is Pin has been around for a while. Pin will play a bunch of cards that'll play Suisse, Under Fire, Naval Power, pin out all of your units. And then on the following turn, they have to figure out a way to pin all of those units again. However, if they play Under Fire or Suicide to pin 3 and then Forced Surrender to pin the 4th, that buys them an entire turn. Because Forced Surrender will pin that unit, and then all of the units that are pinned, including the unit that was just pinned, are going to get pinned for free on the following turn. So it's essentially like I think this is very comparable to Monty, where sometimes Monty just comes down and it's like a pin everything, buy yourself a turn. Forced Surrender is not Monty because it only pins one unit on itself, by itself. Like, you need to run this in combination with other pin cards, but if you are able to pin all of the other units on the board, this is just buying you an entire extra turn. And it's a special, so you can run 2 of these. So you better believe that this is going to be run in pin decks. Now, the question is, how good are pin decks going to be? We've seen a bunch of people try pin decks, even very high up in tournaments. People are playing pin decks in top 6. But some people were struggling with them. Is Forced Surrender going to be the key to unlocking that? Or is the meta simply going to adapt around pin and run things like Rally or like anti-pin tech? Maybe. But I think the name on this card is very fitting, Forced Surrender, because you are going to see a lot of this card when the expansion drops, and you are going to want to immediately surrender the game whenever you see this card. So the name Forced Surrender is very fitting. You're going to play this card, and your opponent's going to surrender. Then we get on to the US cards, and the second keyword of this expansion, we have the M1, or M10A1. It's a 3-cost 4/2 US tank. So the same stats as Hellcat. However, instead of Blitz, this has Deployment Suppress Target Enemy Unit. So what is Suppress? Suppress removes all card text from the opponent's unit. Well, Suppress removes all card text. So in this case, you are removing all of the card text from an opponent's unit. So this includes keywords. It's going to remove, Blitz, Smokescreen, Guard, Destruction. This removes everything, as well as non-keyword effects. So, for example, something like Sexton, where it's at the start of every turn, repin the same target unit. Suppress removes that. So Suppress does everything and more. So Patrol used to be a very popular card in US midrange. It would remove Guard, Ambush, and Destruction. This removes Guard, Ambush, Destruction, and everything else. This is Suppress, just the keyword is just so much better than any of these other tools. And this is very, very interesting because these other tools were always in a position where you want to run them because they're really good sometimes, but just not worth running. However, it now not requiring like a specific combination of keywords to be removed, but rather just remove any card text. Removing any card text is good against basically any deck in the game. Because even the decks that run largely vanilla units, such as US midrange, where, Suppress on Sherman's not going to do anything, because Sherman's a deployment effect. Suppress on, like, a Greyhound is largely not going to do anything, because you're playing it for the 1/3 Blitz body. You're not playing it for the +1 attack to units in the support line. However, there's a couple very, very, very bad things to get suppressed in basically every deck in the game. So, for example, 5th Rangers. If you push up a 4/4 5th Rangers, and then it gets suppressed, its operation cost is going to go back to 4, because it also resets operation cost. It basically just sets the unit to its version in hand. Like, just what's in hand exclusively on stats. And if you push up an 8/8 5th Rangers and play this, it also resets stats down to whatever they are. It does not heal them. So Suppress literally does everything. There was probably a much easier way to explain what this does, but it literally does everything. Because 8/8 5th Rangers, it's going to turn into a 4/4 with 4 operation cost. 4/4 5th Rangers with 0 operation cost turns into a 4/4 with 4 operation cost. Doesn't matter what combination of things you do with it. If you play Weekend Deal with before, if it gets suppressed, it's becoming a 4/4 with 4 operation cost, which is really, really bad. Now, some other honorable mentions, sticking with Frontline, is if Skytran gets suppressed, it is now just a 0/4 fighter that doesn't do anything. It's literally just a 0/4 fighter. It doesn't summon things every turn. And if it doesn't summon things every turn, it's a really, really awful card. And this is true for the 0/4s. Things like the Pioneers Regiment, the Engineers, the Signal Regiment, the Nakshub. these are 0-4s that rely entirely on their effects. However, if they get suppressed, they are just 0-4 infantries with 4 operation cost. So suppressed opens up a whole new door of possibilities for US. Well, at least for this US card, because we see this suppressed card is in US. Presumably suppressed will be in other allies as well, or other nations as well. But this opens up an entire door of just gameplay avenue, because before you really didn't have, you just had to worry about, like, can my opponent remove my unit? Now it's a question of, can my opponent suppress the unit? Importantly, suppress does not remove unit types, so, you know, if you suppress a bomber, it will remove any of the text on the bomber, but it will still behave like a bomber in regards to fighters, etc. So suppress, very, very interesting mechanic, very, very powerful mechanic. How good is a 3-cost 4-2 deployment suppress? Pretty good, actually. If you think about half-track, half-track is a 3-cost 2-2, so this is already just +2 attack on half-track, and half-track is commonly played as a means of getting rid of guards, and because it targets exclusively infantry or air units, it cannot remove guarded tanks. Now, suppress can remove guard from anything, so it can remove guard from the guarded tanks, so it's actually better at getting through guards than half-track is. Now, this is not to say that this is better than half-track and will replace half-track in mid-range, because the other thing half-track does is it's a massive tempo swing, where, you know, if your opponent on turn 4 plays a 4-cost infantry, you play half-track to return it to hand, and then hit face for a bunch of units that cost 0 op or 1 op. That's a massive tempo swing, because now your opponent has to replay it again, and if you have a second half-track, you know, you hit face with everything again, and then you're probably just going to win. Suppress does not do that. However, Suppress does a lot of things that half-track doesn't, so maybe you want to run, like, 2 half-tracks and 1 M10A1, maybe you want to run 2 of each, maybe you want to run 1 half-track, 2 of these. Who knows, but I think this card will absolutely be tried out in Frontline, and I think this card absolutely could be justified to be run in Frontline. So then let's move on to a US Elite, the 13th Engineers Battalion. It is a 2-cost 1-3 with Smokescreen, with the text, gain an extra credit slot when you deploy a unit with 3 or more operation cost. So this presumably is going to be the next, like the theme for US in this expansion. Now, how many units have 3 or more operation cost? There's a number, you know. There's honorable mentions would be 5th Rangers, specifically in 8-8 mode. If you play 5th Rangers and select the 0 operation cost option, you will not gain the credit slot. But, you know, 8-8 5th Rangers, B-17, the B-17F Persian. But the problem is a lot of these units with 3 operation cost are largely things you want to be playing later in the game. So, like, what 3 operation cost things are you going to be playing this with early in the game? There's the 6-6 with Blitz with 4 operation costs. It's a 3-3, 4-op, 6-6 with Blitz. Are you really going to be running those cards just to run alongside this, where you have to stick this unit in the first place, and then you get that, and the bonus of getting that is an additional credit slot, which, like, why would you not just run War Machine and then play better units? So I think this card needs a lot of support to be anywhere near good. I think this is easily the least playable card of the expansion. Well, maybe not. Maybe the Finnish countermeasure is very unplayable. But that is specifically without support, because if US gets a decent number of 3 operation cost early game units, preferably things with guard, or, you know, other nations get that and US can run that through allies, I think this card could see play in the future. I don't know if those cards are coming in this expansion, if those cards are coming in the future, or, you know, it could just never see any support, and it will just remain sucking. And we've seen that with a fair number of US card elites, let's be honest. The number of US elites that receive no support and then never see any play ever is pretty high. It's higher than other nations, for sure. Then we get to Italy, where they have the Fiat BR-20. It is a 4-cost, 2 operation cost, 2-2 bomber. So really terrible stats. Deployment, add 2 3rd Alpine regiments to your support line. And the 3rd Alpine regiment is the 1-2 Alpine, and these do trigger off of each other, so they will deploy as a 1-2 Alpine and a 2-3 Alpine. if you have no other units on the board. Now, obviously, if you're running this card, you're going to be running it in a full Alpine list. So, it's very easy to have a couple Alpine units on the board. So this deploys as a 3/4 and a 4/5. So a 4-cost deploy, summon a 3/4 and a 4/5 infantry in your support line is very, very good. This is a very powerful card for Alpine, specifically because it allows Alpine to easily refill the board with these cheap, low health Alpine units after a board wipe, which is something that all in a single card. And that's something that they struggled to do before, where if your entire board gets wiped, you kind of have to dump like the rest of your hand before you start getting back up to the number of Alpine units necessary to get like the good stats that are going to win you the game. The Fiat allows you to do that very, very easily. However, I think its main role is going to be as a comeback card, because otherwise you need to have 3 open support line slots to play this card, which is not an easy thing to do with an Alpine if you're like, contesting the board, you're not getting just like blown out by a Monsoon Rot. This card is excellent to refuel after a Monsoon Rot. I think it very easily could just like stick in your hand awkwardly if you're against something like Frontline where you're just competing back and forth. The third Alpine is not great. Like if you do get cleared early in the game or you're just off to a rough start, slamming this on curve on turn 4 not going to help. So I think it's a very powerful card, but I don't think this is broken Run for the Hills Alpine #1 meta deck necessarily. I think this is just a very, very powerful card. And again, this is an Italian card, so you do have to run this at the cost of other Alpine units. And Italy does have well more than 12 Alpine cards in the game. So you do have to make choices on to what you run instead of this or what you run this over. Then we get to, so that was the first wave of cards revealed. Now we're starting to get to some of the cards that have been revealed, like sprinkled over the couple days. And the first up is the T-34-85 1944, which is a bit of a mouthful. It is an 8-cost 6/6 heavy armor tank with 2 operation cost, with the text has blitz and guard if you control 3 or more units and it counts itself. So if you have 2 other units on the board, it's a 6/6 heavy armor, blitz, and guard. Now, the guard effect of this is not particularly relevant, I'm going to say, because, one, it's conditional. So if you play this with, like, 2 other units on board, your opponent can just kill one of the other units, this loses guard, and then they go face. So the guard, it's not going to be irrelevant, but it's certainly not, you're not playing this in a Soviet control deck to run it as a guard. You are definitely playing this, if you're playing it, for the fact that it's a 6/6 blitz with heavy armor. Which, there's the 5/5 blitz for 5 cost. Are you really going to play 3 additional credits for +1/+1 in heavy armor? And sometimes it has blitz, because sometimes it doesn't have blitz. No, I don't think you're going to be running this card whatsoever. However, this card is easily one of the most meta-defining cards and the most important and long-term impactful cards that have been revealed so far, despite the fact that I don't think it's ever going to see any play on its own, and that's because the Soviets finally have an 8-cost tank. This has been, like, people who play Soviets have been waiting for the 8-cost Soviet tank of any variety. It literally could have been anything. Like, as long as it's not like a 1/1, an 8-cost Soviet tank is going to be seen in games. Not played, but it's going to be seen in games a lot for several reasons. One, the card Upgrade, which is a Soviet elite destroy a friendly tank and summon a 1 to replace it that costs 3 more. Now, the number 1 deck you would think to play that in would be the T-34 deck. However, the T-34s are all cost 5, and there's no 8-cost tank prior to this, which means you can't play Upgrade on a T-34, which means things like Siberian Transfer, you can't play Upgrade. You can't do turn 2 or turn 4 Siberian Transfer Upgrade. Now, you could, however, they're rotating Siberian Transfer, which is really, really awkward. They're also rotating Red Banner, so you can't, like, get this and then turn it into a Joseph Stalin. It's a bit awkward. I'm not saying that it's going to see a ton of, that Upgrade's going to see a ton of play. The other very big thing, though, with this card is it means you lose 272nd Red Banner in Soviet control, And 272nd without Red Banner is a questionable card to include because it's ludicrously slow, and Soviets do not need like that much value. So if you can't generate 2 Stalins off of it, whether or not you run 272nd is a very big question. However, you previously could not play Stand Together on 272nd. Stand Together is the 1-cost Soviet card that got released in Brothers in Arms, which is destroy a friendly infantry, summon a tank of the same cost to replace it, and give that tank a blitz. So if you play 272nd, and then you play Stand Together on it, you get the T-34 85 1944 with blitz already guaranteed, and you get the Stalin, which is arguably better than getting 2 Stalins, because yes, this 2 Stalins, it has more stats, it has the heavy armor too, it can't be returned to hand. However, it doesn't do anything immediately, and you're losing your guard unit to get this. It's so much easier, and not only does it just cost 1 credit less, to play 272nd, Stand Together, and then you blitz with the 6-6 T-34 85 1944, to like actually have some degree of tempo. So you're not just like spending your entire turn to slam a bunch of stats on the board and then potentially lose. It allows Soviets to be much more tempo oriented. So this in combination with Stand Together, this in combination with Upgrade, this in the future, potentially in combination with the Ural Factories and Red Banner. If they ever come back, I would expect them to come back. I would be pretty shocked if they never come back. But yeah, this card, despite no one ever going to be playing it, is very, very, very impactful for how the game is played, because this is the first Soviet 8-cost tank. Now we have a 2-cost 2-3 Blitz infantry for US. We saw the 2-cost 2-3 Blitz infantry for Germany, the veteran one that gains 3 credits. This is a very, very different one. The text on this is, when this unit destroys an enemy unit, your HQ gains +2 defense. So this is comparable to the Fiat, the 2-3 Fiat for Italy, the 2-3 fighter that your HQ gains your HQ gains health equal to the amount of damage that the Fiat does. This is substantially worse because it has to kill something, which means if it hits something and doesn't kill it, you don't get healing. So this is a substantially worse effect than Fiat. However, what it is it is healing in Soviet, or it's healing in US that does not come at a tempo loss, which typically it does in the form of the milk truck. You know, it's a 3-cost heal 2, do nothing. The We Can Do It's a 5-cost heal 3, largely do nothing. Not that I'm trying to say We Can Do It's bad, but like if you're relying on We Can Do It for healing in, say, a ramp deck or just a control deck in general, it can be a bit hard to play against aggro. Whereas the 142nd Infantry Regiment is a card that you can play against aggro, compete with aggro, fight for the front line, or at least, at the very least, just like stomp the guys that they move up to the front line early in the game, and get a bit of extra health while you're doing it. So this is a very, very useful card for US ramp, US control. Is it a good card? I don't think so. I don't think this is going to be, you know, making US ramp like a competitive deck. And if it was a competitive deck, I don't think you would run this. However, what it does is it makes US ramp that doesn't suck a lot easier to play, especially for people with lower collections, since this is a standard. So you don't have to rely on like Britain ally with honeys and like early guards and supply shortages. You can try to do US ramp with other allies, and you don't lose healing, you don't lose early game presence because of that, because of the 142nd. So it's a very good card to have in the game. It's very healthy for just general deck building purposes. However, I don't necessarily think that this is immediately going to see play. Then we have the H39 SWG, or as it is 100% going to be known, the Swag. It is a 3-cost 1-4 artillery with Fury, which is not great. It's not terrible, but it's not great. It's kind of hard to stick a 3-cost 1-4 Fury, and even if you do stick a 1-attack Fury, already not great without attack buffs, and you're running it in Germany, which can struggle for the attack buffs side of things. However, then you read the next part of the card, which is suppress units attacked by this unit. So as we went over with the M10A1, or I believe that's what it was called, suppress is an incredibly powerful effect, and this suppresses twice per turn. Like, if you can stick this for a single turn, this can suppress 2 things. So I know Aichi is rotating, but for example, if you play this against Aichi and they can't kill it, they deal 2 damage to it, you can just like immediately remove Aichi and it's gone forever. Or you can hit Aichi once, clean it up with something else, and then you suppress something else, and maybe they have a 5th Rangers, you turn that into a 4-op. This card is incredibly powerful. Like, it is difficult to understate how powerful this card is. However, it is a German card, which means it's very hard to use. Like, maybe you can run this in frontline, but, like, you know, it's very good, but it doesn't have much overall synergy with frontline. And it's also a 1-4 arty. It's the 4 health is very important because it does make it very, very difficult to kill compared to most arties in this game are at most 3 health. 4 health, very big difference. It can't be red dawned, for example, or killed by strategic bombing. However, the attack is low, so it's very, very good against things that can be suppressed, but against things that can't be suppressed, it's not going to be like a high value arty in the way that other arties are typically high value, where you're dealing a ton of free damage because they're not responded to when you attack. This is not going to be that card. This is going to be the card that's going to be getting you a ton of value by giving you free suppresses. And free suppresses is very good. However, you need to be running it in a deck that can take advantage of the fact that you're getting all of these free suppresses, and a deck that can keep this alive, or at the very least provide enough pressure on the opponent that they don't worry about this. So maybe this sees play in Jagro, maybe this sees play in Heinz, maybe this sees play in US Frontline. I think it's definitely worth checking out. But I would be shocked if this never sees play in a tier 1 competitive deck, just like at any point in this game's history, because this card is incredibly powerful. I would also be shocked if this card is never nerfed. I fully expect this card to go down to a 1-3 at some point. Now, whether that's in a month or whether that's in like 2 years, I don't know. But I'm calling it now. I definitely think this card is going to be nerfed at some point in the future. Then we have the RAF Mitchell. It is a 6-cost, a 6-4 plane bomber, for Britain. 3 operation cost, has salvage well guarded. So as we talked about salvage, it gives you the 1/1 copy of the card. This card is just absolutely awful. Now, clearly, it's meant to be played in the bomber deck, where, you know, it's a 6-attack bomber. You can play this and deal 6 random damage with the Halifax. It also has 3 operation cost, and so does the Halifax. So maybe you want to be running that in a US Britain bomber deck, where, you know, you're gaining credit slots because you're playing the Halifax and the Mitchell. But in reality, this card is awful. Even if this wasn't conditional salvage, this card would be awful. But also the salvage is conditional, where it has to be guarded. And, like, obviously you are going to be wanting to be guarding this anyways, because it's a 6-cost, 6-4 vanilla bomber, which is just absolutely terrible. Like, it's difficult to understate how bad this card is. And then the, like, one redeeming aspect of it is conditional. This card is just absolutely awful. Then we have the 20th Infantry Regiment, which a lot of people were making a lot of jokes about, because the US has the 1-cost 2/2 infantry vanilla. This is a 1-cost 2/2 infantry with guard for Japan, and they're both the same rarity. They're both standards. So jokes about power creep aside, I think this card is, well, some people were calling this card like, oh, this is just like a vanilla pack filler card. Do not sleep on this card. Like a 1-cost 2/2, just 1-cost 2/2 guard is not a bad card. Now, it's probably not going to see play immediately, especially because I think Dina got rotated. So, you know, you're not going to be running this in control, but, like, if Dina ever comes back, you could play this in control, and as this as your 1-drops, because in, like, a highly aggressive meta. And this is substantially better than, for example, the Soviets have the 1/3 guard for 1. Britain has the Welsh guards, which has been seen play recently. The 1/2 guard for 1. 2 attack is a very good number. So, you know, if you're trading 1 for 1, with an aggressive deck early in the game for Japan, that's good enough. And it's something that's not reactive, because something that Japan Control has often struggled with is the fact that it's a very reactive deck. Or at least it has to be run very reactive cards, especially in the early game. Like, you've often seen people run cavalries or Akita regiments as anti-aggro tools in a control deck where you're playing it out to trade 1-for-1 with something. However, that requires your opponent to already have something in the front line ready to be trading with. Whereas this one, you can just, put it back. It sits around. And it can also be useful later in the game because guard is guard. It doesn't matter if it's on a 2-2 or a 10-10. If your opponent can't remove it other than trading, it gets its desired effect of stopping them from attacking other things. So I'm not trying to say that this card is like amazing and going to see play immediately, but I think a lot of people are drastically overestimating how bad this card is. I think this card has a lot of potential. Then we get on to the last card that I'm going to be showing today, or at least giving my thoughts on. All of these have been revealed and announced already in the Cards Discord, so if you're not in the Cards Discord, you should join it, and you can get the role to get pinged every time there's a card reveal. But the last card I'm going to be talking about here today is the Panther D, a 7-cost, 7/6 elite for Germany. Heavy armor 1, 3 operation cost. So the stats on this card are pretty bad. Like, they're not terrible, but, they're not amazing. The effect, attack damage dealt by this unit is also dealt to the enemy HQ. And this is not combat damage. This is attack damage, which means if this attacks the HQ, this is functionally double damage to the HQ, because you deal the damage and then you deal it again. And if it's not attacking the HQ, you're still dealing the damage. So if you just play this guy out, your opponent has to remove it immediately, because if this attacks 3 times, you just win the game. Because you're going to be dealing 21 damage to the opponent. And also there's situations where, you play this on turn 7, and then on turn 8, you play Bolster, which turns it into a 10 attack unit, and then you push it to the front line and attack the opponent, and you win the game, because you deal 10 and then deals 10 again. So how good is that? Very bad, because it doesn't have Blitz, and, if your opponent can't remove a 6 health, like, heavy elite, like, the bomb, like, the threat that your deck is playing, if they can't remove that, they're probably going to lose regardless of what it is, and, you have other options like the Tiger 1E, which is untargetable, which makes it harder to remove, but you don't get the double damage effect, but, like, at that point, I feel like the double damage effect's a bit win more, but maybe there's ways to cheat it out, maybe there's ways to give it Blitz, maybe there's just, like, a meta where the #1 deck does not have an answer for this, because, for example, Britain typically doesn't run a lot of hard removal, so, like, if you're playing a Britain deck where they're relying on supply shortage to kill this over a series of turns, you run this, you run Rally to get through their pin, and then you just smash them and deal, like, 16 damage immediately, to either win, or they can't Commonwealth, or whatever. So this card has potential. It's certainly not just, like, an absolute trash card. However, it's not that good. So that is it for, yep, this is just the first card. So that is it for this video, but subscribe if you want to see more of these. I'm going to be eventually cover all of the cards that are going to be announced for this expansion. I'm also going to be covering the cards that were rotated out, as well as the cards that were rotated in. And I'm going to be covering all of that in future videos, as well as other content, so subscribe if you haven't already. And thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.